When you look at the film he made, it's from the first minute on, from the first moment on, you can tell there's a unique vision. It's too obvious. You don't have to dig into it. Very obvious. There is something unique about how he deals with people and how he penetrates into their lives with this great curiosity. So that's why the film should be seen.
I got into filmmaking as a 12-year-old boy. I bought a Super 8 camera, called up my friends, had a crew, made 2 films that caused a big stir at the school I was going to, and ultimately were stolen, lost to history. I always knew I'd be a filmmaker. My schooling didn't indicate that sort of course, but even though I was going to Georgetown School of Foreign Service, I knew I was going to be a filmmaker the whole time. I first met Werner at the 1975 Cannes Film Festival. I had been working with Bernardo Bertolucci, and he introduced me to a Swiss director by the name of Daniel Schmid. And Daniel was friends with another filmmaker who I was very interested in, named Werner Schroeter. And Werner knew Werner Herzog. So I went to Cannes and met Werner Schroeter, who told me where to meet Werner, that he was in a press conference for Every Man for Himself and God Against All.
I do not precisely recall how we met for the first time. Alan Greenberg showed up at the Cannes Film Festival when I had the Kaspar Hauser film, Every Man for Himself and God Against All.
It was a circus. I went in there and I was embarrassed in the environment. There were Klieg lights and beach togs, and the whole thing just seemed the wrong place for me to introduce myself to someone that I considered as highly as Werner. So I went back to Werner Schroeter, immediately lied to him out of embarrassment, said that I had in fact met Werner, and was about to explain when Werner Herzog left the press conference and sat down right across from me. And as Werner is a very engaging personality, and he immediately began talking to me about Bruno S., the star of Every Man for Himself and God Against All. And as if on cue, Bruno walked by us at a certain point, and Werner said, "Well, there he is, why don't you go meet him?" And I couldn't get away fast enough because I didn't want to be caught in my little lie. And I went to the seawall where Bruno was looking at the sea for the first time in his life. And Werner had given him a 35mm camera, and he shot picture after picture after picture after picture after picture after picture, never changing the shot, just going 36 times until he used up the entire roll of film. Then Bruno turned to me for the first time and he said, "The sea always remains the same, but people always change. Tomorrow you will turn into a pig." And that was the culmination of my meeting with Werner. About 6 months later, I moved to Munich, and the real reason why I moved to Munich was because I wanted to really meet Werner and get to know him.
And I have a very vague memory of first meeting with Alan. It is much more specific when he moved to Munich. It probably was mostly in order to meet me, but his girlfriend at that time had an engagement as a ballet dancer at the Munich ballet company. It would have probably made me more nervous if I had known somebody just had moved to Munich and to be right around. Maybe it was a pretext by Alan with his girlfriend, but of course there was a realistic background as well.
When I went to Munich, I went over to Werner's house and I showed him some of my photography, and we just traded our stories, and I filled him in on my background, who I was, where I was coming from. I actually had been sent to interview Werner by American Film Magazine. Werner had just burst upon the world stage with Caspar Hauser, and I was the only one in the United States of America, outside of maybe Tom Luddy and Amos Vogel, who gave a damn about Werner. And so I finagled this interview assignment. I was sent to Munich, went over to Werner's house, walked in the door, looked at him and said, "I'm not going to interview you." And he said, "Why?" And I said, I feel like a vulture. I'm not really a journalist. That's all bullshit. I just wanted to meet you." And so he thought about it for a couple seconds, and then he said, "Okay, well, you have to promise to me right now that you will never write journalism again." And I did, and I haven't. And that evening, we just talked a lot. He played me some magnificent music that really altered my entire perception of the possibilities of music. And later that night, he drove me to the train station, and it was about midnight, and it was raining. It was very dramatic, at least for me. And Werner at that point turned to me and asked me to work with him not only on Heart of Glass, but ongoing. And as if to clinch his point, he said to me, "Alan, on the outside we'll look like gangsters, but on the inside we'll wear the gowns of priests."
We became friends, and I can describe what drew me to him. He always had a very exuberant fantasy. Whenever he was around, the air was filled with projects, with quotations from poetry, with music, with ideas. It was always very, very fertile, very wild, full of imagination.
I just began writing screenplays when I was in my teens, and I had no interest in reading anybody else's screenplay or even knowing what the proper format was. So I wrote a few screenplays just for my own edification, and ultimately wrote a screenplay called Love in Vain. That was my first screenplay. And when I wrote it, I just thought of myself as someone who was among the first filmmakers, doing something very basic, very fundamental. And I needed to invent the format. I needed to invent a language to tell my story. And that's what set off my screenwriting career. I think of myself largely as a screenwriter. I like the form. It suits me. There's an enormous amount of room for experiment in it. And I also think it's probably the last bastion of pure poetry in terms of the written word. There are a lot of different aspects to the experience. First of all, I was one of the first outsiders, according to Werner, to witness him making a film. And so there were always certain questions about me mixing in properly with the crew, and particularly with the production manager. But that really wasn't very difficult. Otherwise, it was a complete revelation in terms of the possibilities of filmmaking. Werner is so instinctive, and he is so completely grounded and focused and in touch with the reality about him, that I had just come from Hollywood, where I had been assigned by Paramount Pictures to work on a film called Mandingo, which is about as trashy a Hollywood film as you can imagine. And after 5 days, I picked a fight with the director, and I walked off the set. And going from that experience to working on Heart of Glass, in which I'm dealing with not only a brilliant director, but one who is daring the possibilities of the medium, not just exploring them, but daring them. Like I say, that changed my life. That was a total revelation for me. And to watch Werner complete Heart of Glass was something very triumphant. It wasn't simply making of a film. He had stepped into the unknown and come back with something that nobody else had ever come back with before. And to this day, right up to his latest film, Wild Blue Yonder, that's how I see Werner. He goes places where poets haven't gone before.
We worked on Heart of Glass, where the cast was under hypnosis, and there were many puzzling incidents, and he took it what it was. People believed at the time, yeah, it was some sort of a circus gimmick, and to make things more interesting or have more control over the actors. I think Alan saw right away that it was a tool for stylization, a village community lapsing into some sort of collective trance, some sort of a sleepwalking state. And in order to stylize it in that way, the idea occurred to me, why shouldn't they play under real trance? And we had to solve a few basic questions. Would people under hypnosis be able, under deep hypnosis, open their eyes without waking up? Yes, it is possible. And secondly, would two or more than two people under hypnosis be capable of communicating? Yes, it is also possible. They can have dialogue. And we had some strange incidents where an elderly man in the film, for example, refused to wake up. For 1 hour he would not wake up and refuse, and loved the state and liked himself floating in a strange state of hypnosis.
Well, I didn't really work with the hypnotized actors. I observed them. There were a few curious incidents where they would come to me and talk about their experience. There was one young man who was the star of the film. I believe he was 21 years old, German-born, living in Bogota, and had come to visit family for the holidays or something like that. And he answered an ad in the newspaper for an hypnosis experiment. And Werner met him and decided he'd be perfect for the lead. So now suddenly this kid is starring in a Werner Herzog film. And the first day of filming, the very first shot was a very basic, easy shot. I'm sure that's why they scheduled it that way, just to break the ice. And it consisted of the young man sitting in a castle alone in total darkness except for a candle that he's facing on a long wood table. And he's entranced, and nothing happens in the scene. It's just, it's necessary for the film, but it's not a big scene. But yet, it was difficult because every time Werner would say action, the only action was a huge German housefly that would descend on the breast of the actor. And this seemed to disturb him in his hypnotic trance. He would start to breathe heavily, he would break out into a sweat, and Werner took take after take after take, and it was very difficult. And finally he said, okay, let's break for lunch. So we broke for lunch, and I sat down with this young man and his girlfriend, a painter, and they were both going on and on. Oh, Herzog is full of shit. He's not hypnotizing me. He just likes to say that for his own ego, but he's not hypnotizing me, and on and on and on and on. And then finally he excused himself. He had to get back to the set, but he said, God, I feel really, really, really tired. And I said, what's the matter? Didn't you sleep last night? He said, no, I dreamt that there was this fly on the wall, and it was buzzing so loud and wouldn't leave me alone. Well, I was completely in service of Werner's vision. I jokingly oftentimes refer to myself as Werner's typist. And with Fitzcarraldo, I had been working on on my first book, or my second book, Love in Vain, and I got a phone call from Werner, and he said, Alan, sit down for this one. And I sat down, and he told me that he had FedExed 84 pages of notes written in German and a plane ticket to Munich, and that I was to go there and write Fitzcarraldo. And what I always found very peculiar, particularly at the beginning of our friendship, was that Werner always seemed to think that I already knew what the story was. And in fact, in a way I did, but we never necessarily had to talk about it. So I got on a plane, went to Munich. I should say, I asked Werner, how long do I have to write this screenplay? And he said, 3 days. And I said, does that include jet lag? And he said, yes. So I got on the plane, went to Munich, had the 84 pages roughly translated. They weren't particularly helpful because the translation threw me off quite a lot. And I wrote that damn thing in 3 days, never having a cup of coffee, never doing anything to stimulate myself. And I just wrote the screenplay, but it's Werner's screenplay. I simply carried out what he asked me to do. And the same with Cobra Verde. There was a little bit more leeway in that. A couple of times he would say to me, "Alan, write a song. This doesn't translate. You know, it's unusual dialect, write a song." But again, I would do it entirely according to what Werner's vision was, or what I felt that he was asking me to do. It was by no means a major collaboration in that sort. It was, for someone who was who considered Werner a mentor, it was obviously quite a learning experience for me. When I was on Skellig Rock with Werner in 1976, I shot a sequence of 4 photographs of him standing on a part of the crag that had been named by monks back in the 8th century, the Stone of Pain. And Werner and I were up there, and at one point before I started taking the photos, we were standing on the edge of the cliff, and he turned to me and he said, "You know, Alan, I could throw you off this cliff and no one would ever know." And then I backed off at that point and laid on my back, and I took 4 photos of Werner. The first one is of him staring into the void. The second one, and he's holding a shard of granite in his hand, almost like a tablet, as if he's been to Mount Zion or something. And so he's looking into the void in the first photo. The second photo, he's looking straight at my camera as if he's completely perplexed by the immensity of the void. And then in the third photo, he attacks the void and hurls the shard at the void. And the fourth, he turns right around and he's marching back up the mountain. And to me, that articulates something that I perceive in Werner, and I wouldn't want to try to define it. It's something very personal for me, and probably very personal for Werner too.